Indigenous territories that you are watching today's panel from. I want to tell you more about myself. So my family comes from Afghanistan. We were refugees in Iran, where I was born. And because of, being a refugee, we experienced discrimination and didn't have some freedoms. So we did immigrate to what is colonially known as BC in the early 1990s. And I share this because I feel like many other immigrants have been displaced from their home and have a similar experience. And I'm so honored to have been asked to moderate today's conversation on Unpacking Asian Heritage Month as an Asian person. I've been working as part of Feminists Deliver working group since early last year. We came together on account of the Women Deliver conference. We are a grassroots collaboration of BC-based Two-Spirit people, non-binary folks, indigiqueer, trans women, lesbian women, cis women and girls, and the organizations that support them. The conference took place last year. It was 4 days. It ran parallel to the Women Deliver conference. We have more than 30 member organizations that make up our coalition. Our approach is intersectional, anti-oppressive, and decolonial. We'd also like to mention that the term intersectional feminism is a term coined in 1989 by Professor Kimberly Crenshaw. And this was used to describe how race, class, gender, and other characteristics intersect with one another and overlap. You can follow Feminists Deliver on social media. So we are on Twitter at FemDeliver, Instagram at Feminists Deliver, and you can find us on Facebook at Feminists Deliver. I came to Feminists Deliver through my work at Battered Women's Support Services, an organization I've been with for almost 10 years now. You can follow Battered Women's Support Services at Ending Violence on Twitter, Instagram, and on Facebook. So I also want to go over accessibility before we get started. So we do have closed captioning services that are available as we speak through Zoom. We'd like to give a shout out to Kim Nathaniel, who is from the National Captioning Canada. Thank you for providing this service. We acknowledge that this event will be conducted in a colonial and trade language, English. We aspire to host these webinars in various languages, as languages should not be a barrier to accessing information. However, at this time, we are faced with limitations that make it challenging to provide accurate and good information in other languages. We also acknowledge that internet and tools to tune in are privileged. We're doing the best we can in a situation that we're in. Internet should be a utility, not a luxury. Thank you for joining us in our journey as we work towards more equitable spaces. So we'll have a discussion between our panelists today for 45 minutes to about an hour. And we plan to have questions that you can submit here via Zoom through the questions tool, or you can tweet us at Feminists Deliver. We'll choose about 5 questions at the end to ask our panelists. If you're tuning in from Facebook Live, please leave your questions in the comments section. This is also being recorded, so you will be able to watch a recording at a later date. We're so fortunate to have the presence and emotional capacity from the folks at Hummingbirds Rising. And we're joined by Rhiannon and Andrea, who will wave. You can contact them in the chat box should you need someone to hear you out. Please message them directly. We want people to feel safe, and should discomfort arise, we encourage you to explore your feelings. We do acknowledge the emotional labor it takes on our active listeners, and we ask that if you're a white person, please reach out to Andrea, and if you are Indigenous, Black, or a person of color, please reach out to Rhiannon or Andrea. We're trying to reduce the amount of distraction, and unfortunately will not have a chat box scene and no audio capabilities from those who are attending. And I just want to say a very special thank you to our Feminists Deliver communication specialist, Justine Ramirez, for all her amazing hard work behind the scenes, organizing and putting this panel together today. We're talking about, well, this month is Asian Heritage Month. And to give you a little backstory, it started in Toronto in 1993 and across Turtle Island thereafter, but it wasn't officially adopted by the Canadian government until 2001. And this was proposed by a Hong Kong senator, a Hong Kong-born senator, sorry, Senator Vivian Poi. The point of the month is to celebrate immigrants who have journeyed to Canada from East Asia, Southern Asia, Western Asia, Southeast Asia, bringing our society together, rich cultural heritage representing many languages, ethnicities, and religious traditions. People from Asia, particularly China, have been exploited by British fur traders, for example, starting in the 1770s, when approximately 120 Chinese people from southern China, contract laborers, arrived at Nootka Sound, Vancouver Island, the traditional territory of the Nuu-chah-nulth people. And through centuries since then, we have witnessing the varying treatment and racism that people from what is colonially known as Asia have experienced, including 1923 order in council excluding any immigrant of Asiatic race, except agricultural, farm laborers, female domestic servants, and wife and children of person legally in Canada. Rising Islamophobia towards people of Middle Eastern descent, including the 2001 Anti-Terrorism Act, labor exploitation that still continues and exists today, as seen in how migrants are treated globally. And while all the while, Indigenous people in so-called Canada are being exploited, oppressed, and persecuted in their own lands. Bringing it to today, Asia expands from various territories with a spectrum of their own history of imperialism and oppression. With the rise of racist anti-Asian rhetoric and acts exposed in headlines all over so-called Canada, racism is experienced differently by people of Asian descent. You're probably most familiar with the despicable incident of East Asian women wearing face masks while in public spaces and being violently attacked. However, many Southeast and South Asian people are also highly represented in low-wage labor markets that make it legal for employers to pay poorly, threaten the immigration of status migrant workers, and continue the cycle of precarious living. So, what do our panelists have in common other than being labeled Asian? After all, Asia is a colonial construct, basically coming from the meaning of East. So East of what? White supremacy, capitalism, heteronormativity are all effects of colonialism. So joining us today, our panelists will be exploring the intersectionality of their identities in Turtle Island as part of the diasporic Asian community, their journey through decolonizing while on stolen lands, as well as the epic changes they envision as we transition into an era where systemic jolts are meant to happen. So I am thrilled to introduce our brilliant panelists. We have Abeer Yusuf, pronouns she, her. Abeer is a journalist, writer, and community builder living on unceded Coast Salish territories. Abeer migrated to Canada 6 years ago to pursue her second master's in journalism at UBC, and her body of work includes examining identity and belonging, the intersectionality of race and culture, and learning about how we belong or don't in places and spaces. Connect with Abeer on Twitter at @Abeer or LinkedIn search Abeer Yusuf. Our next panelist, Kimberly Wong, pronouns she, they. Kimberly is a queer Chinese Canadian femme whose work mirrors the intersections of her identity. She has been recognized by the city and the province for her accomplishments in climate justice, multiculturalism, and her work continues to evolve beyond this. Kimberly currently sits as the chair of the City of Vancouver's Chinatown Legacy Stewardship Group, where she is putting her passion for crafting culturally appropriate and progressive policy to use. She also sits as the chair of the Vancouver Just Recovery Coalition, a group dedicated to rebuild post-COVID-19 to better support vulnerable communities and make a safer, healthier city for all. And you can find Kimberly on Twitter and Instagram at KimberlyLW. And we also have Lara Maestro. Lara, pronouns she, her. Lara is a 1.5 generation Filipina settler who came to Coast Salish territory via Mi'kmaqi. She holds a Master of Archival Studies and a Master of Library and Information Studies from the I School at UBC and is a member of the Filipina X Youth and Student Organization, Sulong UBC, an affiliate of Anuk Bayan Canada, as well as Migrante BC. In her organizing work, she tried her best to be of service to her community, both in diaspora and in the Philippines. You can find her work on Facebook at Sulong UBC and on Instagram at Sulong UBC. So let's get into it. So my first question is, what are you seeing from where you are today? Kimberly, do you want to go first?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm looking outside at a swarm of trees. I had to just let in my cat because she was mid-swipe and about to like eat a bird. So you might hear some like door scratches and meow cries from the background when I'm speaking. I'll pass it off to Abeer.
Hi everyone, Abeer here. I'm watching leaves dancing right now. I can see a little bit of wind. So yeah, there's just a bunch of leaves with sunshine dancing. I'll pass it on to Lara.
Thank you. I can see a bus stop. My desk is like right in front of a window, and so I can see the bus stop right across from me, which is like very interesting people watching most of the time, and then some trees. Yeah, that's what I can see today.
Thank you all. So we have been experiencing stay-at-home orders in Canada for the past 2 months. But for some of us having families all over the world, we've been dealing with COVID-19 effects for longer than that. How have your experiences been like so far as a diasporic person, or even in the last couple of months? Lara, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, so I'm Filipino. I was born in the Philippines, and as Rona said, I migrated to what is currently known as Canada in 1994 when I was very young. I moved to Mi'kmaqi, which is on the East Coast, and yeah, so I still have a lot of family in the Philippines, and they've like where my family lives right now has been under what is called like enhanced community quarantine since March 16th, which is basically a total lockdown of the island. So no transportation, shutdown of businesses, families are limited to very strict times when they can leave the house. Only certain people are allowed to leave the house. You have to have a pass. If it's not your turn, then you get apprehended, you get penalized. So for my family, for a lot of Filipinos who are experiencing what like enhanced community quarantine, or if they've moved into even just general community quarantine, they've experienced a lot of isolation and a lot of repression, because if you are familiar with the Filipino government, and other governments around the world have done this too, but there's a lot of using COVID-19 and the coronavirus as a convenient cover for like state repression and fascist crackdown of activists. So you'll see a lot of rules being applied very disproportionately based on who you are in the community. So you'll have a ban on public gatherings, for example, which will penalize activists who try to protest or gather, or people who are trying to demand the food and the resources that have been promised to them. But then you'll have like Philippine National Police will have birthday parties in their house with no masks and no physical distancing, and no one gets in trouble. So you like, that's kind of the picture of what a lot of Filipinos are facing right now in the Philippines, and have been for quite a while, since March. And it's a reason why, you know, we really want Filipinos here to be aware of what people are facing back home, because yeah, it affects us all. It's like the reason that we're here, that we're migrants in the first place. So yeah.
Thank you so much. What about for you, Abeer?
Yeah, thank you for that question. First of all, I just want to say hello to everyone who's tuning in from wherever you are in the world, and a belated Eid Mubarak to everyone. Obviously a very different feeling. Also going into answering your question, Rona, about how it feels to also observe what is such an important holiday for me personally, and to have to experience it while in this situation. It's been interesting. My parents live in Malaysia. That's where I was raised for most of my life. And so also similar to Lara's experience, yeah, strict lockdown orders as well that are kind of easing up a little bit. But it's been interesting because in Malaysia, the difficult conversation has been about the Rohingya refugees who have been detained within a camp. And there are all these like conspiracy theories about how they're spreading the disease, and like how like it's moving from them and stuff. And it's just honestly really shocking, and especially I think more heartbreaking for me as a Muslim person to see such a rampant like escalation of violence against like Rohingya folks who have also like who are refugees and they're escaping, and now they're here, and there's all this like terrible xenophobia that they're facing. So that, and then and also how like Malaysia is recently taking pride in the fact that it's not Malaysians who have COVID, but foreigners who have COVID. So also just a very layered conversation there. And then the rest of my family, which is all in India, and also under strict lockdown orders over there. But also noticing over there, like in India, and as a Muslim family from there, we're seeing a lot of rhetoric around Corona jihad, which is now like the new term to like apparently Muslim people are spreading coronavirus in India. So this is some very interesting, I think, you know, connotations of how like even something like this is being weaponized. And, you know, I was reflecting on this today because I do want to take this opportunity to acknowledge that, especially for people of color, and more so for Black folks and Indigenous folks, it's probably a very difficult time considering what has transpired in the last like 48, 72, and then unfortunately for Black people for almost all of their lives. This conversation of violence against Black bodies specifically now that we're seeing, and how that manifests in the idea that, you know, we're all going through like a pandemic, but then life and its inequities are still carrying on at that same pace, if not at a faster pace in this time. And to me, like, that's what's shocking, is that nobody's taking a pause from any of those activities to carry on those kinds of pieces.
Thank you so much, Abeer. Kimberly?
Yeah, I was snapping along with you from the background. So my name is Kimberly Wong. I grew up primarily on the unceded lands of the title-holding Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. My ancestors came to this land 5 generations ago from the southern Chinese province, Huaishan, and helped build the Canadian Pacific Railway. So they were exploited workers. They did the most dangerous jobs for the smallest wages, but we're also building a railway that played a crucial role in the displacement and colonization of Indigenous people. So the complexity of the relationships like this is something that I hope we get a chance to draw upon today. so far as how I'm doing. I think there's a lot on my mind. With Hong Kong, one of the places I call my homeland, under the direct violence of China, as well as with the upswing in anti-Asian racism, and particularly towards women, happening here. But I feel very lucky to have a safe place to call home, to have access to clean water and food, to be here, and to be in the presence of you all.
Thank you. So to follow up, maybe Kimberly, you want to start. Can you comment on your community's vulnerability to violence and feeling unsafeness at home and outside?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm Cantonese diasporic, so I'm a part of the Chinese Canadian community, I guess you could say. I think there's been a lot of talk in my community with a lot of leaders, particularly in Chinatown, about an increased police presence to quote unquote make our neighborhood safer. And I think there needs to be a recognition that, of course, not all people feel safe going to cops because of complex histories of war and trauma, because of language barriers, and frankly, because they have had a terrible history of protecting people of color, namely Black, Brown, and Indigenous folks. And I am not Black, Brown, or Indigenous, but I think that that's been on my mind a lot, like how we can, find alternatives to calling the police when these things happen, and when we are victims of these things, because they are really all symptoms of white supremacy.
Yeah. And what about for you, Abeer? I know that Kimberly touched on that. What are your thoughts around policing, and does that increase people's feelings around safety?
Thank you, Rona. Yeah, building off of what Kimberly said, I think it depends on who you ask, right? It makes some people feel safe, and it makes a lot of people not feel safe. And I think time and again, we've entered this conversation on who does it not make feel safe, but for some reason, those aren't the people we're listening to. And obviously for me, this entire conversation is also very convoluted because we talk about and I want to acknowledge that I'm a model minority, right? I'm an Indian person, brown, not quite the same level of antagonism that I face that a Black person might face, or that an Indigenous person might face. But that's exactly like the question that I want to pose, and the thought that I want to sort of share with everyone today, is that we talk a lot about like how we assume that power doesn't move. And in the last little while we've been talking about like minorities and East Asian supremacies, and how even people of color have a lot more privilege and such. And I think these moments do help us see actually there is no community of color that has sustained privilege. Like, it's all relational and it depends on context. And this new incident shows us that the rise and spark of violence, which will continue, and of course this is sort of like, I would say, the 9/11 moment for anybody who looks Chinese, right? Because it's not even about if you look Asian. I mean, I'm Asian, I'm just as Asian as Kimberly is, just as Asian as Lara is, but I probably am not going to be the one that gets attacked when I go out on the streets. It's probably going to be like people who look Chinese. But I think the one thing that has been a huge learning for me is that while that might shift for someone like me, someone like Kimberly, someone like Lara, someone like you perhaps even, it's not shifted at all ever for Black or Indigenous folks. And so that's why we prioritize, and we have a responsibility, all of us who are on the panel, to talk about like anti-Blackness with our own communities and talk about that. And I keep bringing that up over and over again because it's so tiring to see how much labor Black and Indigenous folks constantly keep having to do to educate us and to move us along. And like, why do we not get it? Is just kind of what I get upset about a little bit. But yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And maybe we can talk about that anti-Blackness in Asian communities, not just in North America, but also in Asia. How does it manifest itself, and what can we do? I'm posing this to all three of you, whoever wants to jump in first.
I wanted to build upon what you were saying, Abeer, because it's the concept of contested membership has been circling in my head a lot about how like our membership as people of color in this country has been contested and protested since its inception of colonial Canada. And so I think that you know, what you were saying is even more so valid. Model minority myth is fragile, but also fraught. And I think I'm hoping this is a wake-up call to my community, my Chinese Canadian community, of how contested that membership is. And I hope it radicalizes us to learn more about what, you know, Black Indigenous people have been aiming for again and again.
Yeah, I just want to, because I was, you know, thinking about what Abeer and what Kimberly have said, but you know, I think that the questions about violence and about these feelings of unsafety, and also, you know, how we see anti-Blackness and anti-Indigenous racism in our communities, like those are also very like connected questions, right? So especially if like I'm thinking particularly about like this city, and for anyone, for example, who like I do may work in the downtown east side and seeing like the daily and systemic violence that is experienced there, you know, from the state, and also interpersonally. And I think in these conversations also thinking about how, as we've talked about, the violence that has been ongoing or that has been practiced hasn't stopped during COVID-19, and in fact has been made worse and allowed to be exacerbated through even the measures we've taken or encouraged to protect ourselves. So for example, with physical distancing, you know, being encouraged to stay at home. How safe does that feel if you're in a relationship where you experience violence, or if you are, you know, a member of the LGBTQ community and your family isn't, you know, supportive of you? So that there's issues of that. Also issues that we have to think about, like the other pandemics, for example, that have been going on, or the other epidemics that are like concurrently going on in our communities, about the opioid drug overdose epidemic, and how in COVID that's becoming even worse with the issues of getting safe supply. Also things like even with the benefit and with like maybe some of the monetary support that's coming into our communities, it's become an opportunity for like debtors and bad actors to come attack members of our community who like maybe owe money, or who maybe are like indebted to these other people. And what also are we doing? I know, you know, Justine passed on some like comments and concerns of the audience beforehand to us, and one thing I noted was, how do we talk about things like workers' rights, including sex workers' rights within this pandemic? And the fact that, especially if we think about how like coronavirus is spread, and how that might affect like sex workers being able to work and maintain their livelihood, and then the unsafety that that creates. So there's a whole bunch of things that go under that. And then who are those people who we talk about who are primarily affected by it? Are like Black and Indigenous peoples, and also people of color, especially women of color. And it's all of this like connection that we, as Abeer and Kimberly have said, that we really need to address when we have these conversations, and address within our own communities too, because this, you know, the white supremacist like settler colonial state asks like immigrants, asks arrivants to participate in this system, to be complicit in it. And whether, if we don't know it, then we are doing it anyway. So if we are aware of it, then we need to find ways to be antagonists against it. Like we have to actively take on that role with our family, like come collect your family, come collect these people whenever they act or behave in ways that are anti-Black, anti-Indigenous. So yeah, like a lot of these things are just like so connected with this conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. So any comments around, you know, you're talking about like, come get your family, come get your people, to, you know, be responsible. Any comments on, East Asian supremacy? Why do you think this is? What does it look like in Asia? And what does it look like here in colonial Canada? Thank you, Abeer.
Thank you. Yeah, I can go. I want to talk about, I think, one thing that I've noticed having immigrated here as someone in her mid-20s and noticing initially, having never gone to a single Western country, not even to Disneyland in London or anything like that. Don't know why that's my frame of reference, but it is. And just sort of seeing, like growing up in a very different context, I've grown up with very different awarenesses of what a supremacy is. So white supremacy has never been the term that I've ever dealt with. I'm like I've grown up in Malaysia where we've talked about like a Malay supremacy. That's very real over there. People who come, like who are descended from Chinese folks and Indian folks are the folks that are not able to, come up to the same level as Malay people, who are called Bumiputra, or even to see in India, how there is now, and especially now, I think you see greater evidence of this, there is a Hindu supremacy that is on the rise. It's an alt-right Hindu supremacy. And I think for me, that's the thing, is that like, I constantly have felt with other people of color who've been raised here or who've spent a lot of time here, that I always feel like, oh, wow, there are other supremacies. Like I want to tell people that there are other kinds of supremacies that exist. And that in North America, certainly, and perhaps in a more global sense, yes, white supremacy is a big thing, but that for me and for most of the experiences I've dealt with in my life, having grown up in post-colonial countries, and countries that have achieved their independence from, to a large extent have achieved their independence from colonial powers, it is different forms of supremacy. And so for me, the shift that needs to happen is talking about like power, because what's common between all of these supremacies is that there is an abuse of power. There is unregulated power, there is an abuse of power, and it is used to oppress and to silence and to treat people like minorities and treat people like you don't give them justice until they don't scream and clamor and have to go through really terrible situations to demand for it. So I feel like that's one of my reflections, and I believe I'll pass it on to Kimberly next.
Yeah, I mean, I have little to add to that because you said it so eloquently, but something that I wrote down even before you asked this question, Rona, was racial triangulation East Asian. So that's something that I was taught by one of my professors, JP Katangal, and he was talking about how some, in particular East Asians, have mobility and privilege in mobility to be able to move themselves more proximate to whiteness. And that presents itself in terms of skin color as well as in class, of course. But it's something that I wanted to flag as something that might be relevant to this discussion.
Yay, that's a great segue, because I was actually I had also just like made some notes for myself for this particular question. And to Abeer's point about power and Kimberly's point about class, like this is where we do really see that intersection of class and race mattering, and not we can't even just think about it in this like contemporary moment, but it's like historical it's a historical thing, right? So for example, a lot of, let's say, like demographically, even here, we'll say that like the East Asian community tends to be wealthier than a lot of like Southeast Asians or other Asians that have come. And a lot of that is due to things like imperialism, colonization, labor export. Speaking just for like the Philippine experience here, a lot of our compatriots come as migrant workers under the temporary foreign worker program. There is definitely a class background that is a difference, and I think also affects the ability to represent oneself in media, represent oneself in the community, and that affects who is seen as having a legitimate voice or the authority to speak. And I know a lot of us have already talked about this. Maybe it happened before we were actually on, but talking about like tokenism and representation and who gets to speak for who, right? But yeah, so there's a kind of like this historical precedent for why these things are, right?
Yeah, thank you for highlighting why these things are, for sure. Yeah. So my next question is, which is, you know, a little based off of some pop culture. So attorney Sunny Wong, who writes extensively about white sexual imperialism, highlights the trifecta of racism, sexism, and imperialism in how Asian women are consumed by white men. It showed up everywhere, including in depictions on pop culture, including with Ed and Rose from 90 Day Fiancé. So I'm not sure if any of you watched that show. But it has been in the media a lot. Who wants to go first?
I don't have anything eloquent to say about that, but I would watch a panel about 90 Day Fiancé and like, you know, race.
Okay, I'll follow up. Yeah, I mean, it's obviously curious. And I think over here, it's an experience, right? I can't speak for Kimberly or Lara, but I think like being othered and being seen as a sexualized object has always been a thing. And for me, like when I first came to Canada, having been raised this way in Malaysia and in my own particular home, I would wear shalwar kameezes like often. I would like wear, you know, some from time to time I'd wear like a baju Melayu as well. And when I came here, I immediately, it's not even about like sexual imperialism necessarily, but I remember my journalism instructor would look at me, and just because I was wearing like the color yellow or the color pink, she'd be like, wow, oh my God, so exotic. I cannot, like, I'm like, you've seen color before. Like, that's not a revolutionary concept. Like, color exists for every community in clothes, but just things like that were such a surprise that, you know, everything had to come with almost a kind of like backing up theory and a backing up like practice, some kind of like deeper meaning. You can't just wear something because it's fun and it's from your culture and that's about it. So to pivot that a little bit, I think that I recognize why people who grow up in diaspora here have such deep feelings, both of disconnection, but also of connection when you then have it, and constantly having to fight against what seems like both places, right? This mainland culture that you may not be a part of necessarily because you're now in diaspora, but also not quite being part of the white dominant culture, and also having to resist that in your own ways and finding some sort of meaning somewhere in between. So my heart does go out for folks that are raised in diaspora, because it's a tough place to be in, and to constantly be sexualized or othered in a way that does not look at the complexities that make you are it's very I don't know, it's debilitating. And yeah.
That makes me think about kind of the politics of like deviant sexualities, people who are seen as desirable and people who are seen as less desirable as well. This is a personal experience within my own family, but when I was young, I was told I could only date people who were of my own race or people who are white, because it was seen as, you know, you're either dating somebody who's on the same playing field as you, or you're dating up. And so like unlearning those things as I grew up and also came out as queer, I think, you know, that complexified it, but it's a conversation that isn't had particularly within East Asian communities as much as it should be.
I have not watched 90 Day Fiancé. I feel very out of the loop. I have no idea who these people are. Okay, I don't know. Maybe I need to do some homework or something. But in just commenting on like Orientalist fetishization of Asian women, you know, all of these, a lot of the, again, with the historical, you know, kind of analysis, but thinking back to colonization, imperialism, and how these ideas came about, like I still see them represent themselves in our community a lot, these kind of very feudal ideas of what values we attribute to, to Asianness, to Asian women, to what being Filipino is, to what being the right Filipino is, what that means. And I guess I'm thinking about that a lot now because, if you are a member of the Filipino community, you might have been aware of just some incidents online very recently of a woman labor leader who has been like cyberbullied and attacked. She was speaking on the CBC as a representative of her union and not saying anything controversial. And yet, because she's an immigrant, because she's a woman of color, and because there are still a lot of very feudal attitudes of like being grateful, not bringing shame to our community, she's faced a lot of attack for that. And it really is just exposing the colonial mentality and internalized misogyny that is a holdover for us from our history of feudalism and colonization. And it is disheartening, and at the same time, there is, as Abeer said, that kind of generational shift of who is saying that versus who is disagreeing with those kinds of statements. And it's hopeful, for me at least, like I work with youth and students, so knowing that they are standing up to, or at least resisting, those kinds of feudal ideas is pretty hopeful for me. But it's something that we're all like carrying intergenerationally with us, that we all still, that we need to fight, I guess, even more strongly, because we are in this position now. Like there's no other time but now to do it.
Yeah, thank you. And I really appreciate you highlighting the resistance. And I want to hear from Kimberly and Abeer about like what resistance you're seeing.
Are we playing chicken?
Yeah.
Kimberly, you go. I'm waiting for you. You go.
Rona, can you repeat the question? I've gotten lost.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so Lara was just touching on like the resistance that she's seeing, like for example, with the youth that she works with around, the imperialism and, other ideas around, what it means to be an Asian woman. So I'm just thoughtful about like, what is the resistance that's happening? Because obviously there is resistance that, we're not just taking these things and there is resistance from people, and just us having this conversation today, for example, is an act of resistance. So I would love to hear from you, both Kimberly and Abeer also, like what resistance you're seeing or what resistance you're a part of.
Okay, Abeer, I'll go. So I mean, when we talk about resistance, I mean, all I can really think about is the pandemic times, like quarantine times. One of my brilliant friends, Christina Lee, who also works for the Hua Foundation, she started a grocery distribution project for seniors in Chinatown who are largely aunties, are all low income, who face barriers because of language and also because of, worries of being harmed outside because of, because they're elderly. And I think access to essential services like, grocery drop-offs or food, as well as things like libraries and transit and other public spaces are really a privilege that we have, but that not all people have. And so I think about, propping those kinds of services up and propping those kinds of things that serve marginalized people as a form of resistance.
Thanks, Kimberly. That's so sweet and powerful. And to build on that, for me, resistance is really like, I think a lot about education, like that's the word that comes to my mind. And also babies come to my mind, like children do, in the sense of like, I think that if we, and I'm hopeful today, like I know that even the however many hundreds of people are on this call, if you raise good babies, and if you, however you're connected to children, like that's where the key is, you know, like those young people that you and I are working with, have in our lives, that we are aunties to, that we are, you know, mothers to, fathers to, the parents to, that's really where the change is. Because if you are raising your kids in a way of telling them that this is not the culture that I want you to be raised in, this is not the thing that we like, resisting with your children and teaching them and not teaching them certain things, I think that's where it really makes a difference. Certainly, like I find that there's a lot more grassroots organizing happening at this time, because it's pandemic times, as Kimberly gave some great examples. But I also feel like we need to, I read this tweet some time ago, and I'm obviously paraphrasing it very poorly, but that the economy has not stopped functioning. Whose labor we value in this economy and what monetary value we ascribe to it has changed. And that's why we're focusing on that's why we're saying, well, the economy is collapsing, because it's not like white dude tech bros sitting on like Wall Street, you know, like they're the ones that are struggling with like suddenly having to be within their, you know, small 3,000 feet apartments, and they're just kind of like, oh my God, what do we do now, right? So I think that for me is where that shift happens, is more of an awareness. And for people who are going back to like neighborhood organizing, who are going back to community organizing, if it's something as simple as like, let's barter and trade, like how beautiful is that? Because we do that. Again, the culture that I was raised in Malaysia and in my home, like we would quickly run down to like my neighbor's house and be like, oh, we're out of like 2 eggs. Like, do you have 2 eggs and like just a pinch of baking powder? And like those kinds of pieces are coming together. And that to me is also resistance. Sharing joy is resistance. Centering joy is resistance. I feel like we each come to this world and God gives us a duty, a job, a thing to do. And it is my hope that for more of the folks that are white aligned, or that are white passing and have those identities, that what you take away from this is perhaps a call to action, that your purpose is to sit, educate yourself, and then step into action along with us, and also to step into action so that we can all make this world a more just and equitable place.
Thank you. And thank you for talking about, you know, taking action. I want to ask our panelists, you know, how do we become better allies to our Indigenous and Black siblings?
I can start this one off because I think it also relates to one of the questions from the audience about how do each of us support and meaningfully show up for Black communities and Indigenous communities, going beyond affirming that racism against the Black and Indigenous communities exists at a way higher level than we may experience. And work with the intentionality of ending them in Asian communities. So I just read out the question. But yeah, I think it really relates. So I think one of the things that we should highlight is like, it is about changing the hearts and minds through like one-on-one relationships we have in our community, but also, and this is like integral, is having like a material, like acting in a way that results in real material change as well. So by material change, I mean like struggling alongside these communities for changes in material conditions, which means, you know, and I'm going to say this at the end when we talk about organizations we want to boost, but I think like as a call to action for me, there's almost no more important thing that you can do than get organized. And if you want to support Black Indigenous communities, support their organizations also, whether that be through like monetary donations, whether that be through showing up, whether that be through, you know, finding your own parallel struggles, because we all have these these places where we can make an impact, and they won't all be the same one. This battle needs to be fought on multiple fronts, right? And what solidarity should mean isn't just standing with and supporting those struggles that are in Black and Indigenous communities, but finding the places in our own communities, finding places in our own cities and in our own communities where we can take up fights that will contribute to those and help all of us as well. So there's lots of, we've all heard those statements about like unity and how we know we need to find that solidarity. And I think that's where this really fits in. Speaking specifically for the Filipino situation, like Sulong is a part of Anak Bayan Canada, and what we usually say, for example, as migrants, as members of the diaspora, is our struggle is for national democracy in our homeland, because affecting change in our homeland also affects the possibilities for our people to make a living, to make a livelihood, to have a future back home. And it is a concrete contribution to stopping the continued settlement of other people's Indigenous lands as well, because we need to address it at the source, I guess. So like that's one example that I can give from my own community about what parallel struggles can look like. But I think that question is great, because talking and discussing is part of education, which is a very, very valuable part of organizing. But then there's also the organizing and mobilizing part of that, which moves beyond discussion and into action. And that action can take a variety of forms, and it needs to take a variety of fronts, but it does have to be oriented towards like material change. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Kimberly, Abeer?
Yeah, this like, no, you first struggle is funny. But I was gonna say something along the lines of what Lara was saying. Like acknowledgements are important, affirming people's experience is important. But I've found a lot of folks from the Black and Indigenous community often say, okay, those are good, but if you would like to do more, there are, ways that we don't benefit from what you do. And one of those is, through money. So ANYA, the Urban Native Youth Association, is an organization that I would like to say I want to support. I know we're not in that section yet, but that, and then also the COVID-19 Black community support GoFundMe is really important. And I don't think that they've hit their target yet. So if we could direct some love over there, that'd be great. Abeer?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think for me, I think building off of both what, like, I 100% agree with what both Lara and Kimberly have said. And also just a recognition of like, I think that a lot of people are kind of going like, oh my God, this issue is happening now. Like, Black people are facing this issue now. But I want to go back to the recognition that this has happened for, like, Blackness happens to a child. It's something that a Black child deals with. It's what a Black toddler deals with. It's what, sorry, anti-Blackness, I mean, is what a Black child deals with, a Black toddler deals with, a Black teen deals with, a Black young adult deals with, a Black woman deals with, a Black, person deals with, a Black elder deals with. Like, this anti-Blackness doesn't happen suddenly, like at a certain arbitrary point. It happens throughout, like it's a series of microaggressions, conversations, violence, and so many building blocks of oppression that build and build and build and build. And so when I see that there's so much resistance to like even Black people and what they're saying, that's where I am most motivated to change the conversation and shift the conversation to talk about like what has led those Black folks to having that experience and to being so utterly upset and to being so completely enraged and so completely, like feeling helpless and feeling like, what more can we do? Because that's not something that is just happening in 2020. It's been happening since like, since however long millennia of like Black people have been alive. So I think that for me is first important to recognize. putting money where my mouth is. So like Kimberly said, donating to funds that exist, knowing that there are local chapters that are taking that money, leaving the camera behind, I think is a very important philosophy of like, you don't have to share that you're doing all of these things, and unless you're amplifying the work. I think recently there's been a lot of great discourse on like how we shouldn't be posting images of Black bodies dying and suffering. And so that I think is a crucial piece. And for me, like I focus that a lot on like one-on-one conversations with people to understand like, okay, well, why do you think like why do you think that a Black person's tone is not the right kind of tone for you to accept what they're saying? So I think that kind of work is important. And I also just want to shed a light that both in Muslim communities and both in Muslim communities and in South Asian communities and Indian communities in specific, I'll speak to, there is rampant, like, anti-Blackness. Like that is a real thing that exists. So I don't want to discount that and say like, oh yeah, that's great. And it's funny because recently, I think about like a month or two ago, someone said to me like, oh, you wouldn't get it as a light-skinned person. And it was such an interesting experience for me because not that it was a Black person, it was some other person of color. And it was interesting because my entire life I've been made to feel like I was dark skinned. So my mother wouldn't let me like go out into the sun. It was like, oh, to kali ho jayegi, which means like you'll become Black or you'll become dark skinned, and that's not good. So I do just want to highlight a movement of resistance even in India around like other brown bodies who are read as also like who we read as Black for some reason, because that's a very nuanced and interesting conversation. And how like anti-Blackness is perpetrated through that, and how there are examples of that as well, because like anyone who looks dark is just bad, and like we've seen that in tropes in like Bollywood films for years and years and years, and just building off of that. So I think that's kind of where that fight is. And if folks are interested, the hashtag for following that particular movement is Dark and Lovely, so hashtag Dark and Lovely, and a bunch of different movements that exist on that.
Thank you, Abeer and Kimberly. So we're gonna switch over now to questions from our audience. And here's one that sort of builds off our conversation that we've been having. How are you supporting and meaningfully showing up for Black communities in the context of ending anti-Blackness within your communities? We can affirm that anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity happens. So how do we go beyond that and work with the intentions of ending them in Asian communities? Who wants to take this one?
I think I do work in Chinatown, and so we work with a lot of elders, and working with elders who might not understand the language of intersectionality or rather just jargon that we throw around, but understand it on a different level, I think is indicative of peeling back layers of what language that we use, because that is extremely a privilege of ours. So that first and foremost, but also like educating them on the systems of colonialism, of imperialism, that they are very much aware of, but I think haven't been able to name, or haven't had the vocabulary to name, much like the four of us here do. Yeah.
Thank you. So I'm going to go to another question from the audience. So it's important to distinguish between anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism rather than lumping them together. Can you speak to these nuances and intersections between anti-Asian racism, anti-Black racism, vis-a-vis anti-Asian racism, and anti-Indigenous racism?
Yeah, thanks for thank you for that question. So I think you're right, it is important to deal with them as kind of separate manifestations of white supremacy. But it is almost helpful to start from the idea of where they both come from, which is that similar racialized, like false racialized hierarchy that white supremacy tries to instill in us as a, sorry, I feel like I have to talk louder, as a divide and conquer strategy amongst our communities, right? So there is that kind of continuum that white supremacy tries to affect, or tries to get us to collaborate in. But it does manifest itself in very different ways, depending on whether it's anti-Black racism that we are confronting in our communities, and also an anti-Indigenous racism that we are confronting. Speaking to, like, and I'm sure Kimberly and Abeer can add about how they see it maybe manifesting in their communities. Anti-Black racism in the Filipino community, for example, manifests itself as colorism, which I know Abeer has talked about and before as well, but also in like the fetishization of Black culture and the appropriation of Black culture. So there is, like, that's a specific manifestation within my community, and those are things that we also, like, I think there's like a long and complex history for Filipinos with that. Anti-Indigenous racism, on the other hand, the way that I see that manifest itself in my community of migrants, at least, can happen because of that Canadian dream migration story, labor export that people experience as they come here. They obviously have experienced hardship as migrants, and they take in and internalize that the idea that they have to be like one of the good ones, I think, and they buy into then the white supremacist rhetoric of who gets to be a good and bad person of color, and those different manifestations are still, though, part of the same goal from the state, right? The same goal to divide us instead of unite us. And if we think about how then we address those things in the community, it does relate to a lot of the things that we mentioned before, not only direct confrontation, but also, material support, and also acting as in direct antagonism to those forces that are trying to get us to be complicit in the oppression of others, whether that be through these kinds of acts or just like standing by and doing nothing. So yeah, direct action, direct antagonism, I guess.
Thank you. And someone else has a question sort of following up on that last one. Like, how do you all center issues of, like, for example, anti-Black or anti-Indigenous sentiments without co-opting their struggle, either in, talking or in your writing?
I need a minute more with this question, so I'm just going to take just one more minute. So in case Kimberly wants to go first.
Yeah, I mean, it's, I think, difficult because the very reason that we have the kinds of language to speak about these things are largely from like Black scholars. So co-opting their struggle is one thing, co-opting their language is another. Yeah, it's a complex question.
I can go now. Had a bit of a read at the question as well. For me, the solution, like one of the ways that I'm living into that solution is by following like a teaching from Islam that we have, which is where when you do like an act of charity or like something good, your left hand should not know what your right hand has done, is what is said to us. And I really live by those words. I think that especially because we live in an age of such rampant technology, there is such pressure to show what you're doing and how you're learning. And while I do think that that is critical and important to some degrees, I worry about who's showing their learning more for the sake of showing their learning, as opposed to for actually taking the learning and living with it. And for me, the first thing is always like, if I'm not uncomfortable with what is being shared, I'm probably not learning. So I like to personally live in a space of discomfort and hold tension. It's not good for me because I've got a lot more gray hair than I previously was before, you know, I was ignorant and stuff. And I think for me, the other piece is also one thing that I would just gently encourage us all to move towards as a society, and I would love to see us really live into, is this idea of I think we talk about something once we've learned it, and then we go like, oh, you haven't learned it? I learned this. Like, I know this now. So like, why aren't you there? Like, why isn't your outlook as intersectional as mine is? Or why aren't you as like interdisciplinary as I am? And it's very easy. It's easy when you've learned, or it's easy when you can empathize and you're there. But I think it's a little harder to claim your lack of knowledge, or claim that I'm still learning. And for me specifically, because I also do some work in racial equity, I think like I get very like uneasy when anyone claims that they're an expert in that thing. So I think like for me, like that's always a flag around like claiming expertise in something, even though I have lived realities as a person of color, and you know, there are class disparities that I've lived into, I've seen, and I've observed with other people, power struggles. I just don't think that, like, I think I would love for us to all mirror and perform a brave space where we own up to, like, so for example, for me, and I will take a massive leap of faith here and say like, I'm not disabled, I'm not just differently able. So for me, that's where my constant learning happens. I'm not queer. So for me, that is the constant learning that happens. And so I mess up, and I'm obviously also like very scared, because I'm like, oh, someone's going to cancel me. Someone's not even going to understand that I'm trying to do this learning. So even before I speak, and before I'm sure of what I want to speak, I try to learn, and then I speak. So that's just personally how I'm approaching it.
Thank you. So another question from the audience. So how do you practice decolonization in your private lives and in your professional lives? Lara, do you want to go first?
Sure. I was like trying to catch up on some of the questions and making sure that I was, you know, trying to work maybe multiple questions into an answer, because I think a lot of them are related. Anyway, I think it's, yeah. I think that you know, the project or the process of decolonizing is something that we do need to keep in mind, but at the same time, like, we have, like, thinking about our role in it as like non-Indigenous people on stolen Indigenous land is like a nuance that I think needs to be addressed also. Like, there is for example, for migrants, or for like my community, our process of decolonization links us back to our motherland, which naturally places us in solidarity with Indigenous peoples here. But I think the lead for what decolonization needs to look like is from that space. And so, yeah, I guess for me, this is a very like long kind of like meandering answer, but decolonization for me means addressing the systems of, you know, imperialism, colonialism, feudalism, capitalism that have brought my people here, making sure that I'm well engaged in the fight to change that in my homeland. And that is the concrete contribution to projects of decolonization here, which are led by Indigenous communities of each of these lands. yeah, but I'm just gonna quickly, like, because I wanted to also talk, just answer the how to center other, like, struggles that aren't our own without co-opting them. That's part of also that answer as well, because what I am talking about is what I mentioned before, is that the idea of these parallel struggles and that idea of like true solidarity, right? It doesn't mean taking on someone's struggle as your own. That doesn't absolve you of being a settler. It doesn't absolve you of being like non-Black, or sorry, it doesn't, or like non-Indigenous, you know what I mean? Like it doesn't take away these things that you are, but it, you can't transcend anything by being in solidarity, but you can contribute materially to something by being in solidarity, and that comes with finding your struggle and getting organized.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, learning is on a continuum. Both of you have touched upon that, and I agree. So I grew up here, and I wasn't taught about the history of these lands or about my own history even. I remember in grade 10, I learned about both Japanese internment and the Chinese head tax in one hour block, and it was like in a textbook, 2 pages. So I think learning about my own history of colonization, of my ancestors' colonization and of labor is a start, and then like building upon those concepts to learn about the colonization of these lands and to listen to the incredible leaders and folks here who have done this work, trying to tell their stories, so that people don't make the same mistakes, is one thing. And also caring for one another across communities is a form of, I guess, subverting what colonizers, what white settlers have wanted us as communities to do, divide us and make us fight for the crumbs. So that's something that I'm thinking about.
Yes, thank you. A lot to say on this. So I'll just quickly touch on a couple of things. Definitely everything that Lara and Kimberly said, I just want to amplify what they've said. And I think for me, some learnings have been that if you start consulting a checklist, you're not doing it right. If you're trying to do it because you want to be like, okay, I did this course, I did that, I did this learning, that's not kind of where it is. I think it needs to start, we need to start examining like, okay, how can we put what we have, and recognizing that we each have inherent gifts. We can give the gift of money when we have it. If that is not accessible to us, we can give the gift of time, and we can also give the gift of attention, and we can give the gift of like making sure we read Black thought, Indigenous thought, amplifying that thought, and amplifying those voices where we can. And I think for me, radically, the shift is also a recognition that we need to change our power structures and upend them, because the ones that we have right now, especially in North America and the way that they work, they're very specific ideas of leadership. And I don't want to see this anymore. If I'm being honest, I want to see leadership that is grounded in collective community and is grounded in a different way, because this way, it's so type A, it's so Western, it's so colonial. It benefits the person that has the most amount of voice, and I want to show evidence of that just in the way that, like when Kimberly and I previously in this conversation were saying like, no, you go, we need to make space for other people, right? And it's so evident that that Kimberly and I, just because we were the two folks in this interaction, were like saying, no, I'm making space for you, but no, I'm making space for you. No, but you make no. So this sort of, why isn't that the norm? Why don't more people think before they do that? Not that I'm saying I'm the model of like everything perfect, but why isn't that the way that other people also think? So it's a small minor interaction, but that shows, because otherwise, if this was a panel of cis-abled white men, I can bet you, Rona, that if you asked a question, it would be like, yes, I have 58 points. Let me tell you all my 58 points and how amazing I am. So that's, yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, for sure. Totally agree. Okay, so next question from audience. So how can we grapple with and support women experiencing higher rates of domestic violence due to extended COVID-19 stay-at-home policies? Lara, do you want to?
Yeah, yeah, thank you for this question. Just briefly touched on that previously in the question about increased levels of violence, but yeah, we've seen numbers of like intimate partner violence like spike during this time. These measures that are supposed to keep us like safe from coronavirus aren't always the ones keeping us safe in our personal lives. Fortunately, though, that's something that was flagged very early on by lots of women serving agencies, and Rona can speak to this a little bit as well. But there have been lots of like crisis lines set up, and these services are still continuing as essential services to support women who want to, or who express a desire to leave their home. You know, they have protocols in place. They're still going, like as we've all said, like, you know, fascism doesn't stop, violence doesn't stop. So our also work in supporting women who experience violence must also not stop, and it hasn't. It is a little bit more difficult. There's maybe more considerations, but yeah, there are still many ways that organizations are meeting those needs.
Thank you. And just, yeah, I think awareness is a big part of how we can support people. So, you know, checking in on our friends, our family, our neighbors. And I think a lot of people in the community are doing this right now, is checking in on people. And I know at like Battered Women Support Services, for example, we are getting calls from, you know, people calling, you know, my friend is in this situation or my neighbor's in this situation. So there is a sense of community and people caring. And I know I'm seeing that also because this question has come up. So I would say, like, really support your local organization, share information and resources with folks. I think those are some ways to support women during this time where, you know, social isolation is mandated. So thank you for that question. We're going to move on to another question. So what do you want allies to do when they are witnessing anti-Asian racism? Who wants to take this on? Kimberly?
Yeah, I think it's contextual. I mean, if you are somebody, if I were somebody who looks like me, who's witnessing a, like, you know, a big man attacking somebody who looks like me, I'll feel more hesitant to intervene physically because I'd be putting myself in harm's way. So first thing is to, you know, check in with yourself and see if you feel safe doing so. Also, I was in a call a couple of days ago and somebody posted a link for a bystander intervention workshop, which I'm going to put in the chat here. I can't vouch for the organization, but from what I've read of the description, it looks pretty like 101. It could be a good starter to talk about how to de-escalate circumstances and to be a good bystander.
Thank you so much. Anyone else want to take that on?
Yeah, I would say think about, I think there's a lot of ways of doing it. I definitely agree with Kimberly as well. But I think that one of the things that I'm also noticing in this time and in this moment is that we're just asking more Asian people to do that labor of saying, like, what do you want? Like, tell us, you know? So it's almost as if like someone's hit you and now they're telling you, listen, how can we like help heal this? Why don't you ask, like, why did you hit? Why did you hurt that person in the first place? So I think that has been a bit of a frustration in, like, especially the mainstream media coverage of these issues as well. And recognizing that anti-Asian racism, this is a very violent and obvious manifestation, but that there are other ways that exist. Like there's online hate, there's trolling, there's so much like doxing and like just terrible things that people are doing to undermine folks of that look Chinese, right? That look like they might have the disease. So I think that there's nuanced conversations. I think if you see it in person, I think it is important to say, you know, like, hey, this is not okay, but also calling in other people, like gather the people that are around you. And also for your community that you know are like Asian folks or folks that are feeling the fear of like, well, what if this happens to me? Offer it to them, to be like, you know, can I get you groceries? Can I drop by some food? If you don't feel comfortable going out, like, do you want to go out together? Do you know, while socially distancing? There are many other ways that we can help, that we can be allies. And I think constantly I come back to education and like taking time to even post those resources on whatever social media presence you have, you know, wherever you can, even if it is an email signature that you can put it in, so that like folks know, and so that the labor doesn't rest on people that look like Kimberly to constantly have to say, don't do it, folks, like just don't do it.
Thank you. Lara, do you want to add anything? Or should I move on to the next question? You're good? Okay. So last one, how do you practice self-care to support yourself?
I've been asked this question before. And there's this thing called the magic bag that my mom gave me. I have really bad posture. And so you put it, it's like a bean bag that goes around you, around your neck, and you put it in the microwave and you heat it up. I think the optimal time is around 2 minutes. And it's like a heated bag that you put on your shoulders and it feels like a cat snuggling you. It's great. So that's that. But also just like, I've been going on lots of walks, looking at, as Abeer said, leaves say hi. Yeah.
Thank you. Lara, Abeer, any tips? How have you been practicing self-care?
Okay, I'll go. Magic bags are great. Like I always used to call it like a magic sack, but I think that's because it's French. It's like le magic sack or like sac magique or something, which I think is even more funny than magic bag. Yeah, great question. I feel like all of my answers though are like a choose your own adventure, but the ending is the same, because I'm just gonna say like, you know, self-care is also community care. So it's like about getting organized, about making sure that, you know, like a lot of the things that are getting us down or that cause us to feel challenge or feel struggle are things like, you know, our jobs or being overworked or like all of the different racism and microaggressions that we might experience. And like as a bigger picture thing, they're part of these systems of capitalism, right? Of white supremacy, of settler colonialism, and ending though, like working to end those while also getting to hang out with like really cool people who are also working towards the same goal is like really energizing, really inspiring. And a lot of times I find that that's where my, you know, you like recharge after some weeks that might be difficult. Like this week was like very difficult for me, and I know a lot of Filipinos, and it's only through like talking to each other and strategizing about what we should do and how to respond about these things has been the most helpful, I think, for me.
Thank you, Lara. Such great points. I actually want to acknowledge that someone was gentle and kind enough with me in the chat to correct my terminology and my wrong use of the word differently abled, and corrected me that it should be disabled. So thank you, first of all, for that learning and for trusting me enough to share that learning with me. And that is actually my answer, is community care. For me, like self-care is not the way that I define it. I define it as community care. So when I am held accountable, when I'm called in, when there is a conversation and when there is an opportunity to talk about these things, to talk about missteps, to talk about good steps, everything, that I think is where I feel very like happy, because I feel like, okay, someone cares enough to have a dialogue with me. Someone cares enough to say, hey, Abeer, I saw this wasn't very cool, maybe you should consider, or maybe, you know, like, hey, this is not the right thing to say. So community care is big for me. It's obviously hard right now because I don't have any family in Canada. All my family is obviously very, very far away, and I'm very glad that I have some chosen family here who I can spend time with. And food is obviously something very central to my culture. So meeting around food is really important. During this time, I've been lucky enough to have the time and mental capacity to actually make food, like foods that are culturally relevant to me. So doing that has been really affirming. And I think this is going to sound really stupid, but spending as less time on the internet as possible, because it's a garbage dumpster fire situation sometimes. And you're just like, oh my God, what is, you know? So a few of those pieces I think have really been helping. And the fact that this is going to be my last Zoom call of the day is very exciting to me. So that's some self-care there already.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So I just want to end our conversation today with asking you, you know, what are some organizations you'd like to, or movements that you want to amplify right now? Kimberly, do you want to just rename the ones you suggested earlier?
Yeah, absolutely. So one that I didn't name, HUA Foundation, HUA Foundation, is currently working on ideas of how to create dedicated spaces to learn how to build solidarities across groups, particularly within our own Chinese diasporic community. So Jackie Wong and I are in the process of working on a workshop dedicated to unpacking supremacies within the Chinese Canadian community. But we've been slightly delayed due to the pandemic. I'll put the links in the chat right here, as well as the other Indigenous and then Black organizations that I would like to lift up.
Thank you so much. Lara, do you want to go next?
Yes, sorry, I was like looking up because I was like, oh, that's such a good idea, Kimberly. I should put links in the chat, and then I was distracted from the Zoom. Yeah, I think, you know, again, I'm gonna say it again, but I think I just want to amplify the opportunity for all of you, all of us, to get organized, to like be in a collective, to act together. That's really the only way that we can make change. One of the things that we're doing right now here in what's known as Vancouver is Kapit Bisig. It's a mutual aid and community care network. We provide support to like the Filipino and migrant community. If you want to learn more, you can email, or you can just go to Kapit. Okay, I'm just gonna put it in the chat because I don't want to spell it out. And then the other one is, if you are interested in helping initiatives that are happening overseas, there is a similar mutual aid network happening in the Philippines called Citizens Urgent Response to End COVID. So it's Cure COVID. And they provide like PPE, medicine, food, all of that stuff to communities who are under lockdown right now in the Philippines.
Amazing. I'm going to go with a couple of things that I want to share. Number one, Indigenous Climate Action. Please donate to them. They do fantastic work in the realm of climate justice, and they're, if not the only, if not one of the few, then the only like organization that is Indigenous led around climate justice action. And just, they have some amazing philosophies and principles they work off of. Number two, it's not so much a movement, but for all of our own education, we should be downloading, buying and downloading this workshop workbook that Michelle Nahaney of Decolonizing Practices offers. It's called, oh, you wrote that, Kimberly? Is that what you, oh, that's so funny, cool. So
I just put it in the chat, sorry.
Too funny. Are we twins? And then there's also Nisa Homes, which offers transitional home and shelters for Muslim women escaping domestic violence and bad living situations. So definitely that. There's obviously a host of other great organizations. There's also Sanctuary Health. There's Migrante BC. So many of these, great organizations, but the two pieces that I really critically just want to leave everyone with is, please be critical about where you give. And when I say critical, I mean like there's Sanctuary Health, which does a lot of like organizing by themselves a lot of collective organizing. And right now, so many individuals, mostly people of color, folks of color, are coming together for organizing, and they are not receiving any kind of paid remuneration. They're doing it for the larger piece, but it requires, the work requires you to contribute funds so that they can continue that work, so that they exist outside of institutions. And then the last point that I want to make is that I don't know how, if many people know, but the, tax receipts and all of the stuff you write out to like registered charities, I encourage you to donate to non-qualified donees. Qualified donees are the folks that can access funding only if they have like a registered charity status. But there are so many people that are doing grassroots work that don't have the registered charity status. So they are non-qualified donees. And specifically, I just want to quickly give like an example of the Greater Vancouver Food Bank, which has recently started some practices that are just not equitable, that are not dignity informed. So really to keep in mind, like, I know the first thing people think of is like, oh, food. And then the second thing people think of is the food bank. Think and ask them critical questions, please ask them critical questions as to who they're giving the food to, what kind of ID they're asking for, because a lot of places do not have a dignity informed lens, which we need. We don't just need a trauma informed lens in the work that we do, we need a dignity informed lens, and there are organizations that aren't doing it. So please just think and just ask the question. I'll do the labor, we'll all do the labor, just ask us, I will tell you. Thank you.
100%.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you so much for our brilliant panel. We encourage you to continue these discussions through our event page for this event or in your own circles. Please subscribe to Feminists Deliver email updates. That's feminists, plural. And please stay in touch with us on our social channels. We do have an event, another webinar happening next week. That's Thursday 4th. And you'll learn more information about that event through our social media. So we're on Twitter at FemDeliver, Instagram at FeministDeliver, and Facebook, you can search us at Feminists Deliver. So thank you so much, everyone, and have a good evening. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.